Good afternoon and welcome to our webinar on developing the 2017 Long-Term Energy Plan. I'm Mike Parks from the Energy team at the Environmental Commissioner of Ontario's office. As you probably know, today's webinar will focus on some of the highlights from our report on developing the Long-Term Energy Plan, which was tabled earlier with the Legislature earlier this week. You can download the full report from our website, eco.on.ca. It should be available right on the front page. If you can't find it there, check the special reports section of the website. I'll introduce Commissioner Diane Sachs in a few seconds. Just like to give a few technical details first. We expect the presentation will take around 30 to 40 minutes. You're welcome to submit questions to us at any time using the questions feature on GoToWebinar, which you should be able to find on the control panel. Just press the orange button on the control pane and that should open it up. We will hold questions until the end of the presentation, and then we will try to get to as many as we can in the time allotted. So with that, I'd like to introduce Commissioner Dr. Diane Sachs to present some of the highlights from our report.
Thank you very much, Mike. Lovely to have you all with us today. Thanks for making the time. Hopefully you have the report in front of you, or you can easily get it. We are going to turn off the pictures so you just look at the slides and not at us, but we'll be back to answer your questions at the end. As you, hopefully some of you have read our past energy reports, and you'll see at the end of this report we've summarized the key recommendations from past reports that are still outstanding, still relevant, and something the Ministry should still take into account. All right, over to you. Okay, so hopefully what you now have on your screen is, well, you will momentarily have, there you go, an overview of our report and what we're going to talk about today. So the first thing is a few minutes of background on energy planning in Ontario for the last 12 years since Ontario Hydro was broken up. Then we'll go through our recommendations for planning the 2017 Long-Term Energy Plan, which is intended to guide Ontario's energy future for the next 20 years. We have 5 major concerns about the process that's now being used to plan Ontario's energy future: alignment with climate targets, environmental protection, conservation first, evidence-based decision-making, and public and stakeholder participation. And we've organized our recommendations around these key themes. 1 minute of introduction. I hope you folks all know who I am, but just in case, I am not the government. I'm an impartial and independent, nonpartisan legislative officer. I was appointed unanimously by the 3 parties. I am the guardian of the Environmental Bill of Rights, which is a series of tools for public participation in significant environmental decision-making, which includes things like long-term energy planning. And I am a watchdog on government policy and practice on 3 quiet little topics: energy use and conservation, greenhouse gas emissions, climate change, and environmental protection. And I am required by law to file a report each year on each of these topics. Now what you see on the screen now are the cover sheets of the annual reports, well, mostly annual reports, that the ECO Energy team has prepared since we were first given the mandate to report on energy use about 8 years ago. And each of these reports has contained findings and recommendations. And as I indicated, the key ones are summarized in this report. Basically, the report, the special report that we've issued this week, builds on those previous recommendations and applies them to the long-term energy plan process that the government has now developed. So, quick word on how we got here. Basically, for those of you slightly older, you remember that Ontario Hydro was a vast organization that was responsible for all aspects, really, of electricity generation and major distribution, other than local distribution in local areas, for many years. In 2004, the government decided to break up the Ontario Hydro monopoly and establish a number of separate organizations. The Ontario Power Generation to continue operating some of the major power generation facilities, and the Ontario Power Authority was a new agency which was charged with ensuring the adequacy of electricity supply and transmission around the province. Well, Hydro One doing the transmission, but the Ontario Power Authority really to make sure that all the pieces fit together, worked together, and that we had a reliable source of electricity, which we sure didn't in 2005, that provided good quality electricity at a reasonable price and would continue to serve the public interest going forward. The Electricity Act specifically proposed a process, well, not proposed, established a legally binding process for planning how we would supply and distribute electricity in Ontario. And that process was called the Integrated Power System Plan. And at the time, the government recognized that there's a very strong public interest in such a plan, and the Act provided for oversight by the Ontario Energy Board, which included public hearings, gave the public the opportunity to challenge government assumptions, bring their own evidence, ask questions, and lead to better decisions. And in exchange for that, the entire process was exempted from environmental assessment. Now that process had tremendous potential to give us a good energy plan, at least on electricity. It was limited to electricity. And it began to work as the legislature had designed. The Ontario Power Authority was required to develop an integrated power system plan. They did propose one. In 2006, they filed it with the Ontario Energy Board. The Energy Board began public hearings. A tremendous amount of effort, public and private, was put into that hearing. Excellent participation and comments, I'm sure, by some of you. But in the middle of the process, it was aborted. The Ministry of Energy, right in the middle of the hearing, directed the Ontario Power Authority to amend the plan. Well, that put the whole Ontario Energy Board process on ice, and the Ontario Power Authority went away and presumably worked on developing a new integrated power system plan. And in the meantime, all of the major decisions that the law said were to be guided by the IPSP as approved by the Energy Board were simply done by government directive with very little public review, very little disclosure of the underlying facts or assumptions. This was challenging, was criticized by our office once we became involved in this area, but really it was expected to be temporary. But that's not what happened. So in 2010, 4 years after the original IPSP had been proposed to the Energy Board, 2 years after the Ministry of Energy interfered in that process, we got a new document. But it wasn't a new integrated power system plan. It was a new thing called the Long-Term Energy Plan. Now the real challenge with that, the fundamental challenge with it, is that there was no legal or statutory basis for this process. And it didn't have any component of the kind of public review that the Energy Board was supposed to provide for an integrated power system plan. But there was still some hope that there would be such a thing. The Long-Term Energy Plan contemplated a subsequent integrated power system plan. There was subsequently a draft supply mix directive to the OPA, which was intended to trigger a new integrated power system plan, but it's not what happened. Instead, Ministry of Energy continued to basically run energy planning in Ontario by unilateral directives without any comprehensive or public evaluation. And what we saw next was a new long-term energy plan in 2013. Again, no legal or statutory foundation, no compliance with the Electricity Act, which required an IPSP, and the new one didn't even pretend to contemplate an IPSP. It was just its own document. And this office strongly criticized that, and as you can see, this is a quote from our 2014 report. A law on the books that is ignored and has been replaced with an extra legal approach under the sole purview of the Ministry of Energy is inadequate. And I guess I can say that if I'd been writing that report, it would have been a little more pointed. So now we come to today. The Electricity Act, as amended in the spring this year, does have, for the very first time, a legal foundation for a long-term energy plan process. That is a good step forward. And it does have several other good features. First of all, for the first time, it recognizes that system planning has to be about energy, not just electricity. Those of you who have read my energy report, our energy report, which we issued in spring, will remember that electricity is only 20% of Ontario's energy supply. It's the smallest and cleanest of our major energy sources. And to do energy planning that ignores 80% of our dependence is simply not sustainable. You don't get good planning that way. So some recognition that energy is not just about electricity, some requirement for public consultation on the environmental registry, and a requirement for the ministry to get a technical report which would be available to the public and which sets out the technical assumptions on which planning is to be made. So those are all good features. It's not by any means a perfect legal framework, and I imagine that many of you were among those who made submissions to the legislative committee or to the ministry about this. But anyway, this is what we have. We have a very small role for the independent electrical system operator and the Ontario Energy Board, a very large role which is not supervised and for which accountability is very limited for the Ministry of Energy. There's limited transparency on the rationale and final decisions that are made in the long-term energy plan. There's no opportunity for a challenge to the assumptions used by the ministry as there would be in front of the Energy Board, and there's no clear time frame, although that may happen. So we've asked the question, well, all right, this is an imperfect legal framework. How can it be made to work? Again, some good news. Congratulations to the ministry. This is a key thing that they did right, is that although the Electricity Act only requires release of a technical report about electricity, and that's the Ontario Planning Outlook that the ISO prepared. But in addition, the Ministry of Energy did acknowledge that 80% of Ontario's energy is supplied by fossil fuels, and their technical fuels report was commissioned from Navigant and was also released. So this is a good thing. And they also released a consultation discussion guide, and there's now doing a public consultation. So again, all good things. Then we get to our 5 key concerns. The first one, and the most fundamental, is this. We have in Ontario, by law, made a commitment to reduce our greenhouse gas emissions very substantially. 15% by 2020 as compared to 1990, 37% by 2030, 80% by 2050. This is going to require an astonishing transformation of our energy infrastructure. And again, it's not primarily about electricity, it's primarily about fossil fuels, because in 2014 and 2015, 91% of Ontario's electricity was already low emission. Now, the long-term energy plan covers about 70% of Ontario's greenhouse gas emissions. And as you can see on this chart, it's most of the emissions from buildings, the small amount from electricity, largest amount, very large amount from transportation, which is our fastest growing source of both energy needs and emissions. And about half the emissions from industry are from its energy supply, but the other half are from process emissions, which aren't covered by the long-term energy plan. Now, that's important because when we think ahead about how Ontario is going to achieve its greenhouse gas reduction targets, the energy system has to reduce commensurately with the rest of the economy. No one has an easy pass here. Every part of the economy is going to have to do its part. And if the energy plan, energy system is contributing 70% of our greenhouse gases now, they can't have more than 70% of our greenhouse gases in 2020 or 2030 either. So what does that look like? Well, Ministry of Energy hasn't released that, and conspicuously did not release this information in their public consultation on their energy plan future. So we have looked at the outlooks described in the technical reports, And they represent varying degrees of electrification of heating, transportation, and industrial use, what other kinds of fuels could be used, what kind of conservation options there are. And they're described as if they were a full range of options. And if you put them together, this is what it looks like. So what you see here is outlooks B, C, D, E, and F, which are looked at in both of the reports, both on the electricity side and on the fuel side. And if you sum up the reasonably anticipated emissions from each outlook, this is what they would look like between now and 2035. And as you can see, Outlook B, which assumes really no growth in electricity demand, greenhouse gas emissions don't drop. The only outlook that significantly drops greenhouse gas emissions from the energy sector is Outlook F, which is the red dots at the bottom. But not a single one of these outlooks would be compliant with Ontario's climate targets. So what you're seeing on this chart is the same outlook calculations that we showed you on the previous slide, but with two new lines. The green line is the climate targets, the greenhouse gas reduction targets, sorry, not the reduction targets, the total emissions permitted by the Climate Act for the entire Ontario economy. And you'll see that Outlook B would have emissions just from the energy sector of more than that. The blue line at the bottom is the one that matters. What this shows is what the maximum GHG greenhouse gas emissions from the energy sector would have to be for the energy sector to be contributing proportionately to our greenhouse gas reduction targets. And not a single one of the outlooks will achieve that. Even Outlook F, which is described in the documents as an extreme electrification option, doesn't reach 70% of our greenhouse gas reduction targets. Ontario cannot reasonably comply with the Climate Act and reduce our emissions as we must using only these options for our energy system. But we have to recognize that not only are the outlooks themselves inadequate, but the government has not come up with any plausible mechanism for achieving the higher electrification options, because right now there is a major cost difference between natural gas and electricity. Now, I hope you all know that the story that goes around that renewable electricity is a major cause for our current electricity rates. I hope you all know that's not true. And I hope you also all know that it's not true that Ontario has the highest electricity rates in North America. But it is true that on a per unit energy basis right now, natural gas is very cheap and electricity has become more expensive as we closed our coal plants and rebuilt the capacity of our electrical system to provide renewable energy, also as we started paying our bills. So the question as to how the government is going to bring together its different policy objectives so that it will both achieve an energy plan that makes sense and achieve its greenhouse gas targets is really challenging, and we see no indication from the consultation guide or from the ministry so far that they have come seriously to grips with this question, which is absolutely fundamental to our energy and environment future. Which leads to the next point. Energy infrastructure has a huge environmental footprint. One of the key factors that happened in the Electricity Act when the planning system was moved away from environmental assessment and to the Energy Board was the idea that the Energy Board would supervise and provide accountability to make sure that energy system planning, cumulative impact on the environment, was properly identified, assessed, publicly reviewed, and that's essential in order to have decisions that have public legitimacy and support. And yet there is no such process anymore. So I'm going to ask Mike to explain this chart.
Thanks, Diane. As you just pointed out, to meet our climate targets, it appears almost certain that we will need to electrify much of our energy use that's currently from fossil fuels. So the most important point on this chart is just the amount of new electricity generation that we might need in order to do such a thing. You can see it's on the order of 15,000 to 20,000 megawatts of entirely new generation. And these are various resources mix that can provide that, differing amounts of nuclear, water power, wind, gas, demand response, and imports. And so each of these choices has its own environmental impacts on our land use, on our species, and so on. And there's no evidence so far that the government is weighing out the pros and cons of the different resources in determining what the appropriate supply mix would be.
Thank you, Mike. And what we know is that while there is some sort of review process for individual projects, the central questions are about the supply mix as a whole. And if the supply mix decisions are made without any comprehensive or cumulative review of the impact of those choices, we may lock ourselves into a future that simply is not sustainable. So this is a critical hole in the long-term energy planning process as we now have it. Third major weakness in the process as we now have it is that it doesn't really do what the government has committed itself to do, which they must do, which is put conservation first. Now we know that energy efficiency measures are among the most cost-effective ways to reduce emissions. The International Energy Agency has reported that nearly 40% of the emission reductions that the world needs by 2050 can be achieved by being more efficient. And we certainly know that Ontario is not very efficient in the use of energy. Sweden, for example, has been able to reduce their building energy use by more than 80% in the last generation. And yet we see no real commitment to conservation in these planning documents. There's no change to the existing electricity conservation targets. There is no change to how the benefit of conservation is analyzed, and the result of this is to dramatically underweight the true value of conservation, particularly if we do get serious about meeting our climate targets and fuel switch to electrification. Right now, as everybody knows, we have an ample supply of electricity in Ontario, and quite a lot of the time we in fact have surplus electricity. Quite a lot of the time we have surplus electricity that we still have to pay for. And therefore, at the moment, the process used by the independent electrical system operator to evaluate the financial and environmental benefit of conservation is pretty modest. We have a 15% adder for all environmental benefits, air quality, health, climate, everything else. And that really represents a conclusion that conservation doesn't save much. It doesn't have a realistic social cost for carbon, and doesn't reflect the new carbon pricing mechanism that we're moving into. And it can be sort of justified for Outlook B in the assumption that, well, you don't have to build new generation anyway, so all you're saving is running costs, and our running costs are not very high. But that's not the kind of future we're talking about if we look at Outlooks D, E, and F, where we need massive fuel switching to electricity, in which case, as Mike just showed you, there could be a very substantial economic and environmental footprint for new electricity generation and transmission infrastructure. Conservation will save a lot more money when you compare it to those options, the probability that we will have to build new electricity supply and transmission. And when we ignore that opportunity and that likelihood, we then are underpricing conservation, which means it's being dismissed as not economically appropriate, and we're not therefore doing nearly enough of it. And yet more conservation is going to be critical to having an energy system that we can both afford and live with. Okay. So very possible to have more conservation. Accurate cost-benefit analysis of conservation would make a big difference. We've recommended before and recommend again that new energy infrastructure should simply not be considered and should certainly not be funded for needs that can be met by conservation. And conservation is essential for all fuels, not just natural gas and electricity, and certainly not just for electricity. And what we see is that not just the long-term energy plan, but also the regional electricity planning is being done on a very short-sighted basis, where the focus is all on wires and very little focus on conservation. And we also see no coherent links between regional electricity planning and community energy planning. It's great to see the emphasis that the province has been putting on encouraging communities to do their own energy plans and to put conservation, give conservation a real role in those plans, but it doesn't roll up into the regional planning. Fourth, the decision-making that's being done by the government, is it based on solid evidence? Now, I had the opportunity on a number of occasions to challenge government folks who are generally excellent on their assumptions, and guess what? They're not always right. We get much better assumptions, we get much better plans if we give knowledgeable people the right to ask questions and offer evidence and challenge government assumptions and look for better opportunities. And that's really lacking in this long-term energy plan process. So here's a couple of examples. One of the big ones is this question of nuclear electricity. You probably all know, I hope, that nuclear provides nearly 60% of our electricity, which is one of the major reasons why we have low-emission electricity in Ontario. But only about 10% of that 60% is coming from units which are up to date. Most of the units at Bruce and Darlington need to be refurbished. In addition, Pickering is just about at the end of its useful lifetime and will need to have a license extension if it's going to continue to operate until 2024, as the outlooks assume. So what we see in the outlooks is really an almost unquestioned assumption that there will be no delays or cost overruns for the refurbishment, even though there's never been a refurbishment of a nuclear plant without delays and cost overruns, and an assumption that the Pickering license will be extended, which is not up to the province. It's up in the first instance to the Nuclear Safety Regulatory Commission. So if everything goes perfectly, a Goldilocks world, that's great. But what if it's not? What is the government's contingency plan? And all they've told us is, don't worry about that now, we'll figure it out if it happens. That is a completely inappropriate way of making a plan about the foundation for our entire economy. Second example of short-sighted focus is this question: what role should natural gas play in supplementing electricity storage options? Now, on the one hand, we say, this is a great question. We're delighted to see the government recognizing that we don't have to solve electricity problems in a silo. Storing electricity is expensive, and quite often there are cheaper ways if we can look across energy sources. And natural gas can help with that in a number of different ways. But it's not just natural gas. One of the simplest examples that was explained to me is this question about, for example, thermal storage, or to use it more simply, an ice box. Right, 100 years ago, one of the ways we stored energy was we collected ice in the winter and used it in the summer when we needed to cool stuff. Well, we can do that today. And the Windsor Casino, for example, is using cheap surplus electricity at night to make ice. And so on the hot summer afternoons when electricity demand is at its peak, they can use that ice to provide cooling. The point is that if we narrow our focus too much, we will spend too much and get options that don't work as well. We can get much better results if we recognize that many forms of energy and energy planning work together. But there isn't enough evidence in the planning documents to make this work. Right, and just want to remind you we're almost at the end of the presentation. If you do have some questions that you'd like to ask, please send them in to us so that we'll try to answer them the best we can. Or maybe it's all perfectly self-explanatory. All right, so finally our question is about public and stakeholder participation. As I mentioned at the beginning, one of my jobs is to be the guardian of the Environmental Bill of Rights. And one of the key insights in the Environmental Bill of Rights is that key environmental decisions, and I'd say the same about energy, are too important to be left just to the government. That's not how we get the best decisions. Nor do we get decisions that the public will accept as legitimate if they haven't been heard. What we had under the original 2004 Electricity Act was a process that contained all the essential elements for a decision that had a good chance of being fair and well justified and a good chance of legitimacy of being accepted by the public, even people who disagree, as having been a fair decision reached in a fair way. And there were three key aspects to that process. It was transparent. The evidence that the decisions were based on was put in front of the public, and stakeholders had an opportunity to challenge it. And there was, in this case, the Energy Board, which had the duty and the opportunity to hear meaningful public input taken into account and bring all that into the final decision. And each of those is essential for a multi-billion-dollar decision that the public will have to pay for. And they're all missing from the long-term energy plan process that we're now looking at. Now the government says, well, don't worry, we are consulting, we've got this consultation right now. And it's absolutely true, they are having a consultation right now. But what are they consulting on? They're consulting on general motherhood principles. They're not consulting on a specific long-term energy plan. So no one knows whether they will be affected or how they will be affected. There is no concrete proposal for anyone to engage with. And nor is there any indication that we're going to see one. The kind of discussion guide that the ministry issued is a useful addition to a detailed consultation process, but it's not a substitute for it. And yet we don't have any indication now that we're going to see anything better than what we have now. No indication from the province that they are going to table a draft long-term energy plan. And even worse than that, we have no way of telling whether we're going to see policy stability after the plan is adopted or whether we're going to see the ministry continuing to issue ad hoc directives from time to time to change the plan that's been adopted. And without policy stability, we cannot expect either the public or the private sector to make the kinds of investments that they need to make to transform our energy economy as we must do to reach our climate targets. So that's why we've issued this special report. We are tremendously concerned that this long-term energy plan may not get us where we need to go. These 5 huge gaps in proper planning for our energy future lead us with deep and abiding concern. Each of you has the opportunity to comment to the Ministry of Energy about their long-term energy planning process. The comment period ends December 16th. There is an opportunity, as you know, through the Environmental Registry to file those comments, and we hope that you will. So thank you very much for this. I'm going to turn it back over to Mike, and we'll try to answer some questions.
Thanks very much, Commissioner. Hopefully that presentation was helpful to our audience. As a reminder, please do submit comments to us right now. We'll try to handle as many as we can before the end of the session. First comment that's come in, do you have any comment for municipalities who are in the process of completing municipal energy plans as to how to go about that?
Well, absolutely. The key comment that we have is that we hope that your plans will indeed be consistent with the climate targets, and that you'll do the things that we call for in here. Make sure that you think about the environmental impacts of the mix that you choose. Make sure that conservation is seriously considered first. The challenge that we know some municipalities have is that they've been expected to make plans on a very short-term basis, and conservation measures often take a number of years to pay back. So we would urge you to think about what's the best way to achieve your total objectives, and don't be afraid to take a longer-term point of view. Another thing that we would encourage you to do is to think about what you're trying to save. Conserving electricity is important, and it can save you a lot of money. But most of the time, conserving electricity doesn't conserve emissions. So for example, converting to LED streetlights is a great idea for saving money. But it is not, at the moment, going to produce any emission reductions because we don't have any displaceable GHG emissions from our electricity systems at night. So if you're trying to achieve both climate benefit, as I hope you will, and economic benefit, then when you're focusing on what energy to pay attention to, fossil fuels are more important than electricity. And when it comes to electricity, you get the best greenhouse gas bang for the buck if you are focusing on peak time. So I hope that's some help to you. If you'd like to talk about it some more, please feel free to get in touch with us. Mike is the incoming head of our energy team, and we're really interested in the kind of challenges that you have. We're particularly interested in your challenges in relation to the nexus between water and energy, which we're going to be putting a report out next year. We've been having some fascinating discussions with municipalities about the many ways that those questions interrelate, including, for example, methane capture from sewage treatment.
Thanks very much, Commissioner. The next question I have, just a process question. Will this presentation be made available to the participants? We will post the presentation on our website shortly after the webinar. Check back within a day or so.
Right, and we'd encourage you to let your friends and colleagues know about it if you think they'd be interested.
Next question we have, are you concerned about the greenhouse gas implications if natural gas is used to make up the shortfall in the electricity supply? I'm presuming that is if we run into hiccups with the nuclear refurbishment process.
Right. Well, the answer is, of course I am. As you may have seen from the climate report, most people dramatically underestimate how serious the climate crisis is. I hope you all know that this, just in the last few months, I mean, since our climate report went to press, world sea ice is collapsing. We're 10 standard deviations below normal. So absolutely, I'm concerned. I'm very concerned about anything that is going to increase our emissions at a time when we dramatically need to reduce them. And that's why not paying enough attention to conservation is so serious. We really have, I mean, the one thing is we're terribly wasteful in Ontario. The good news about that is we've got a lot of room to improve. And we can save money, we can improve our air quality. Another thing that is important to recognize is right now Ontario spends more than $11 billion every single year importing fossil fuels from outside the province. That's $11 billion that drains out of the province every single year, and that doesn't produce jobs here, that doesn't help create a better future for our kids, and that we have to buy again the next year. If we can get more efficient, reduce our fossil fuel dependence, we can keep that money in Ontario, and that gives us a much better chance of having a prosperous economy.
Okay, thanks, Commissioner. Next question that's come in. Do you have any comment on the global adjustment cost increase from $160 million per month to over $1 billion, and what that might include?
Well, I'm going to get out of my depth pretty quickly here. We did in our energy report include a chart showing what was in the global adjustment in 2014, and 45% of it was nuclear, about 10% wind, 10% solar, a large component for gas and for water. We would expect the nuclear component to go up. As you probably know, Ontario Power Generation has applied for permission to increase its rates for nuclear power that it's providing to Ontario. So in our next energy report we will have another analysis, but I hope that answers the question. Oh, and Mike's going to add and help me here.
Yeah, I just want to make one point there. So the global adjustment is needed to cover all the fixed capital costs from all the various generation assets we've added on over the years, and so it's difficult for us to reduce that cost. But we do have choices we can make as to how that global adjustment is allocated among electricity customers, and by doing so we can potentially avoid increasing the global adjustment from new generation. So we've been strong proponents of pricing signals that would allocate some of the global adjustment based on your consumption at peak times, which the government has adopted to some degree. We'd like to see more use made of that.
One other piece that's just worth noting is that the reason the global adjustment, the fundamental reason that the global adjustment has ballooned is that the pricing structure for hourly electricity frequently doesn't cover very much of the hourly cost. It just covers the marginal cost. And so producers have been, because of some of the contracts were signed, enabled to move a lot of their costs from the hourly cost into the global adjustment. If the pricing structure is reformed, more of the cost will be in the hourly cost and less will be shifted into global adjustment.
Thanks, Commissioner. Our next question is a difficult one, but I'm sure you've got some insight. How much is the current public and political focus on the price of electricity going to change this discussion about where the 2017 long-term energy plan will go?
That's an excellent question, and you're absolutely right that the enormous public focus on the price of electricity makes it very difficult to have a sensible discussion about what is much more urgent, which is the climate crisis. Wherever I go, I'm encouraging knowledgeable people, which I hope includes all of you, to be talking to your colleagues and your neighbors and your friends and your church groups or any other group you work with so that they do get a better understanding of why our electricity rates have gone up and how important it is that we think about the long term and not just the short term. I find it very useful to remind people that in 2005 we had 53 smog days in Ontario. My husband had serious lung issues, and on those days it was painful for him to breathe. I know a lot of people who got either children or parents who have breathing issues, asthma issues, anything else, and if for people who care about those folks, it really matters that in 2015 we had no smog days, in 2016 we had one smog day. We have dramatically improved the air that we breathe and the health of a lot of people we care about by closing those coal plants. And yes, it put the price of electricity up. But we have to remember that electricity looked cheap in 2005 because we weren't paying what it really cost. We weren't paying what it really cost in health damage. We weren't paying what it really cost in mercury pollution in the rivers. We weren't paying what it really cost in terms of letting our system deteriorate until its reliability was in shreds and patches, and we weren't paying the true cost of the money that we had borrowed. So electricity looked cheap, but it wasn't true. I recognize that it's very difficult for people on fixed incomes, but the real answer for that is to reduce electricity requirements by improving the energy efficiency of homes and appliances, and those of you who are in municipal utilities have a tremendous opportunity to help those folks. And if we can focus on what is the real issue, maybe we can get the discussion back to this enormous challenge which is coming right down. I mean, if we think we've got problems now in electricity prices and we let it take the place of dealing with the climate crisis, well, it's worse than moving the deck chairs around on the Titanic.
Yeah, thanks, Commissioner. Our next question, of the 4 planning scenarios that have been presented, just to clarify, there were 4 scenarios in the electricity technical report with 2 further scenarios presented in the fuels report. So of the planning scenarios, is there a preferred scenario to plan towards, or will it be a weighted average of the 4? I'm not sure if the question is whether what would be preferred from your perspective or whether the government has a preferred scenario.
The government hasn't formally indicated its preferred scenario, although it's possible they would prefer one that doesn't increase electricity prices. But I start from we have a legal commitment to reduce our emissions of greenhouse gases, and only Outlook F takes us anywhere near achieving that commitment. So to me, it is clear that's what we need to do. I bought a plug-in car.
Thanks very much. Our next one, not really a question, but a comment. When we discussed the risks associated with nuclear, comment that another major risk associated is that of nuclear waste.
Nuclear waste, absolutely. There are no shortage of other substantial issues facing us and people around the world. And I don't mean to underplay the concern about nuclear waste, but at this point I am satisfied that by more than an order of magnitude, by many orders of magnitude, the biggest challenge that's facing us right now is climate change. And we're at a stage, a point in history. The Secretary General of the United Nations said, you know, we're really the first generation to really experience the impacts of climate change, but we're the last one that really has an opportunity to change what happens. We've got maybe 5 to 10 years to bend the curve, to try to keep to a 2-degree world, which would still be basically recognizable, or to change the climate in a way that has never occurred in human history and that it's not clear human civilization can survive. And I know it sounds alarmist. I am going to have a webinar on my climate change report, and I will walk through to you why I say that. But we've got a really short window that matters a lot. And in that period of time, climate change is the most important thing. If we can survive that, then I'd like to get back to worrying about nuclear waste afterwards. I would love to be in a place where nuclear waste was our worst problem.
Yeah, thanks, Commissioner. Next question, I think, probably shares some of the comments you made on the previous question will likely apply here. Do you think we can go to 100% renewable? I don't know if this means renewable energy as a whole or renewable electricity in particular.
I mean, clearly we can eventually, but that will take time, and that will require being innovative and careful and experimental and playful and trying things out and looking at all kinds of different energy sources. It's certainly not something we could do tomorrow. Al Gore always says there's no silver bullet, there's only silver buckshot. That is, we need a lot of different small ideas, each one to contribute. I'm delighted to see organizations like Google making commitments to go to 100% renewable power and getting there pretty quickly. For a society as a whole, it will take longer, but there is so much we can do. And again, when different systems work together, I'm really excited to see municipalities, for example, looking at their organics treatment, their landfills, and their sewage plants and saying, okay, can we harvest the methane from those? Can we use the heat from those systems? What can we, and in Sweden they're doing this a lot. We have lots of opportunities to do better, and every time we do stuff better, we can learn another way to improve on that.
Yeah, thanks very much. Our next question, will the long-term energy plan consultation documents clearly publish the expected electricity prices we'll see from the different scenarios and the assumptions that go into making those prices?
Well, we think they should. One of the points of this report, and again, one of the reasons we turned ourselves inside out to get this report out, is that yes, that stuff should be public. You deserve to know, but it's not there. They need to disclose the assumptions, the evidence that people really need to make good comments and good decisions, and so far they haven't done it.
Okay, thanks. Our next question, a little general. Do you have any thoughts on financing innovation in the energy sector?
Absolutely. And in fact, I'm meeting regularly with folks in the financial world, including at lunch today. Some of them tell me, there is no need for financing innovation, that they already have all the tools that they need to do it. The Canadian financial industry is notoriously conservative, risk-averse, and they are going to have to step up to the plate. And so that's one of the reasons that I am talking to the pension funds and so on. We know, as documented in our climate report, that Ontario has a long tradition of fostering brilliant technical innovation and spinning off small companies that we then leave to die in the valley of death. One of the proposals in the Climate Change Action Plan that we've supported in our climate report is the government's proposal to use some of the proceeds of cap and trade to help clean tech companies through the valley of death if they are going to significantly contribute to greenhouse gas reductions. And if any of you have a brilliant idea on how to make that happen, John Godfrey at the Ministry of Environment and Climate Change is consulting with folks right now on how to make that work. So speak up if you've got a great idea.
Thanks, Commissioner. Our next question directed at our office. What is the ECO doing to counter the general knowledge that the current costs for electricity are largely due to the Green Energy Act?
Well, I talk about it every possible chance I get. I put it in, I think, 2 of our reports so far. If you have other suggestions as to how we can help, let us know.
Yeah, thanks. Okay, another tricky one perhaps. Will recent political developments in the United States, e.g. the new appointment for the Environmental Protection Agency, how will that affect the direction we take here in Ontario?
I don't think it should affect the direction that we'll take. One of the, we're all mostly grasping at straws for optimism in light of the U.S. election, but one of the reasons for optimism is that at the Marrakesh Climate Conference, the Conference of the Parties number 22, which just happened in Marrakesh, not a single country said they were going to pull out of the Paris Agreement because of the statements of Mr. Trump. Not a single country, not OPEC, not Russia, not even Venezuela. And that's really astounding considering how difficult it was to reach the Paris Agreement. I think that the sea is going to continue to rise no matter who is the U.S. president. There is no question that some things will be more difficult. If he really does hamstring the scientific community in their efforts to measure the rate of melting, for example, if NASA was blinded, we wouldn't know right now how bad the situation is with world sea ice. So we would be trying to make plans with even less knowledge as to how serious the situation is, and that makes it harder to make good decisions. But I think that the rest of the world is going to keep moving because they recognize how important it is, and if all else fails, probably the Chinese will do it. They have set themselves out quite clearly to own the economy of the 21st century, and they think this will help them.
Okay, thanks very much. Next question, a little bit technical in nature. The questioner says, half the greenhouse gas emissions from the electricity sector come because we need to keep gas plants running at a low level so they can ramp up and down to follow demand. Why aren't we using conservation and demand-side management instead of the gas turbines for that function?
Well, certainly we have called consistently for more use of conservation demand-side management. We think there's enormous opportunity to do more of that, and that's one of the reasons why proper costing is so important. If you only take a short-term point of view, then you're right. We may do too little conservation, which is what we have done, and then there is more reliance on gas than there needs to be. We think there's enormous opportunity, and again, looking at municipalities, for example, I had the privilege of being at a water plant this month, and they have great capacity to shift load away from peak, but they've just never done it. Well, why? Well, nobody ever asked them to. So, well, that's an obvious opportunity. I think we have so many opportunities around the economy. One of the advantages of a price on carbon is that it will start drawing people's attention to some of these opportunities, but I'm sure you guys can think of many more that I haven't.
Okay, thanks very much. I think we've just got time for a couple more questions. We'll finish with two more. Next question that's come in, if I submit comments on the long-term energy plan on the environmental registry, what will the government do with my submission?
Well, I have not been given a crystal ball or a magic wand. The government is required by law to consider public comments, but they then have the right to make the decision that they see fit. So they will have to read them, they will have to take into account, but they are not required by law to do what you say, or what I say. And what I do suggest is that by all means comment through the registry, but also speak up in other forums. And the more people make their voice heard about this, the better the chance that the government will act. Certainly, I strongly recommend that you speak to your MPP. Politicians are very sensitive to what their constituents say to them.
Okay, thanks very much. Next question. The Ontario Planning Outlook scenarios seem to combine demand projections for energy sources with strategic choices. Would it be your preference to have the alternative strategic choices identified in the documents and then each one of them tested against different demand scenarios?
I have to say I don't actually have a position on that. It's an interesting point of view. Our general view is that all of the supporting assumptions should be made public, right? How else can you give people a real opportunity to analyze and contribute? If there are supporting documents, supporting assumptions, they should be disclosed.
Okay, thanks. This will be the last question we'll take this afternoon. From the four outlooks for electricity sources, is solar being considered as well?
Solar isn't an outlook. It is a source of low-emission electricity, and my understanding is that the planning outlook for electricity does include a certain projection as to how much solar we will have. One of the challenges for the ISO, the Independent Electrical System Operator, is that a lot of solar generation is embedded. That is, it's not connected directly to their system. They have very accurate information about the bulk power that flows over the bulk transmission, the high voltage transmission lines. They don't have very good information about local generation and things that happen, quote, behind the meter. So that's a bit of a challenge in getting better data. But no, they definitely recognize that solar will grow, and the faster the costs drop, the more interest will be in that.
Okay, thanks. Just add one comment on that. The questioner may have been asking about the specific slide we showed earlier in the presentation, which showed the resource mixes to meet a high electrification scenario. Yeah. And solar is not one of the options listed there. The reason for that is that under high electrification scenario, the peak demand would switch from summertime to wintertime after the sun sets, because that's when we have the highest demand for building heating, which would now be partially electrified. So while solar has a role to play in the long-term energy plan, it's not shown here as an option to meet that new increased peak demand.
All right, well, thank you so much for those excellent questions. That was really, really appreciated. So glad that you were interested and able to join us. Look forward to having you join us for our climate change webinar. This was our test webinar, so you have been our test audience and you've helped make us a success. Thank you so much.